and we are ready to get started. So, once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, the NatMech Emerging Equipment, Technologies, and Capabilities to Address Travel Monitoring Basics and Beyond. This webinar is being presented in partnership with the National Travel Monitoring Exposition and Conference, or NatMech. The attendees of today's webinar will become familiar with the emerging sources for bicyclist and pedestrian count data and their advantages and disadvantages, understand how crowdsourced data can be evaluated for their potential to quantify walking and bicycling activity, and learn how practitioners and researchers can use these emerging data to develop, apply, and validate network models. I would like to introduce our presenters for today. We have Sean Turner, the Senior Research Engineer at Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and Sirisha Kothuri, Senior Research Associate for Portland State University. And our Q&A moderator today will be Sarah Worth O'Brien, the Senior Research Associate at UNC Highway Safety Research Center. And at this time, I would like to turn things over to Sean Turner to get started. Sean, you may go ahead.
All right, well, thank you very much. So this is Sean Turner from TTI. You know, I have to admit that I kind of miss the in-person NatMech. I mean, if you haven't been to NatMech, the conference was so much more than just the technical content. You know, I miss seeing friends and colleagues. I miss the fun bike ride that we've been having for the past 5 or 6 conferences. It's called Tour de NatMech. But I think the biggest thing I miss, it's the ice cream that they serve in the exhibit hall during the mid-afternoon breaks. You know, I mean, it's the small things, isn't it? So regardless, I'm happy to be here with you today virtually, and I'm going to be heading to my freezer right after the presentation for a midday snack. It's probably going to help my raspy voice a little bit, but I hope you'll join me in keeping the NatMech ice cream tradition alive, at least until we see you at the next in-person NatMech. All right, so here's what I'm going to talk about today. Emerging data sources. What is emerging now, and what do we expect in the next few years? And I should say this is specific to biking and walking and other forms of active transportation. But hopefully that's going to be a quick 5 or 6 minutes, because what I really want to focus on is the question that most of us ask about these emerging data sources. That is, when is it good enough? When is it good enough for us to use? So I've spent about the last 30 or so years looking for more and better data, and I've learned a few things or two about knowing when it's quote unquote good enough. So I'd like to share a few of those key principles with you, and then share you some of the recent evaluations that'll hope to maybe serve to better illustrate some of these key principles. So it would kind of feel incomplete if I didn't mention a few of the data sources that have already emerged. And I mean, these are regulars. Hopefully these are regulars in your data collection toolbox as well. Some of you may not be familiar with the term active crowd sensing. Active crowd sensing just means that the pedestrian or the cyclist has to take an active part in the data collection. In other words, they have to activate data collection on their device. And so down at the bottom right-hand side, you see Strava. Strava is probably the most common active crowd sensing because people have to start an activity for it to be recorded. So like I said, most of you have probably used these data sources extensively in the past 5 or so years, and we know quite a bit about their strengths and their limitations. A type of crowdsourcing that's still emerging is called passive crowdsourcing, which means that the user has to do very little or nothing in order for their data to be collected. They simply have to agree to the app's terms and conditions that say, hey, I agree to being tracked in exchange for this free and convenient information through the app. And so there's all sorts of flavors of passive crowdsourcing, from single apps like Ride Report or One Bus Away to aggregators that basically combine LBS data, location-based services data, from multiple apps. You've probably heard of Streetlight Data, SafeGraph, and QByQ, and of course Google. The common denominator is this: location tracking with passive crowd sensing, it really happens in the background, and it happens on hundreds of millions of phones worldwide, even if that app is not being used or even if the phone is in sleep mode. Video analytics is another emerging source of biking and walking data, and there's a pretty healthy marketplace with lots of options. So some systems come with their own cameras, and some will take any video that meets some basic requirements. And even better, which is a really big plus for safety applications, is some of these video systems actually run tracking algorithms, and they output safety measures of effectiveness, sort of like conflicts, like near misses, and if you haven't heard of the PET, post-encroachment time, it's essentially how close do people get without actually colliding. Here's an example that's just emerging, but I expect that we're going to see lots more of this in the next 5 or so years. So newer model vehicles are really roving data collectors with hundreds of sensors. And one of those sensors is pedestrian and bicyclist detection, which essentially runs their collision avoidance systems. So these pedestrian and bike collision avoidance systems, they're all on the newer model cars, even on what I would call, what I call budget cars. And guess what? The auto OEMs, they've started selling connected vehicle event data in the past few years. So they've already started selling things like data items like hard braking, automatic emergency braking, windshield wiper usage, things like that. And in fact, one fleet telematics company already produces hotspot maps from their pedestrian collision avoidance system. And I'll show you that a little bit later in my presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, I've been looking for more and better data for most of the 30 years of my career. And so I'm kind of used to new gadgets and new widgets, but maybe I'm getting older, but even as a gadget guy and a data geek, I'm starting to feel a lot like this practitioner who in his email, he's talking about this dizzying array of new data and these new data providers that are springing up. And it's really, it really is hard to keep up with the latest and greatest given the pace of new technology. And so there are issues that come in whenever we do evaluations. And I find myself explaining some of these basic principles repeatedly to whether it be our research sponsors or product manufacturers or data providers or who have you. And so I'd like to step through these 3 principles in the next block of slides, and I'm going to illustrate each of these 3 principles with real-world examples. Okay, so this is number 1 for a reason, because this issue comes up the most. It comes up a lot. So often when people want to evaluate something new, they want to compare it to what they've been doing. Let's call that the status quo. But guess what? The status quo can be wrong. The status quo can be hugely inaccurate. And so that's why I like to clearly differentiate between a ground truth. Sometimes I also call this a benchmark or a status quo evaluation. And so if possible, I always want to collect and use a ground truth. So this is something that I know that is very, very accurate, or I know precisely the confidence interval around my measurement. And so that way, whenever large differences arise in the evaluation, which they inevitably do sometimes, I can conclusively say that the differences are in fact error in the new method and not what I'm comparing it to. So sometimes though, ground truth is really difficult to collect, and we simply have to rely on status quo. We have to rely on what we have available. But in those cases when we have differences, we may not know whether that difference is caused by error in the new method or error in the status quo method, or maybe it's just a combination of both. So let me illustrate this with an example of crossing pedestrian counts. So I talked earlier about video analytics and being used in different applications. So there's several newer traffic signal systems can automatically count crossing pedestrians with the same field of view that it uses for motor vehicle detection. And so we wanted to test two different video-based signal systems, and we wanted to strive to get that ground truth to compare against these two systems. Well, since these systems are video-based, we can simply record the video that the machine sees, and we can count the video manually. And we can get humans, and when I say humans, I mean inexpensive college students, to count manually. But is that ground truth? Well, not really, because we know that people make errors in manual counts, especially if they do it for long periods of time. And so we commonly use a process that we call double-blind counting. In other words, we have two different students. They conduct independent counts, and their answers, their counts that they come up with, have to agree to a very tight tolerance, say maybe 2 or 3% at most. And so if they agree within that 2 or 3%, then we take the average. If they don't agree, then that means that one of the two students made a mistake. We don't know. They both have to recount it until we finally get within that acceptable tolerance. And that's how we know that we have high accuracy in our ground truth. And so these are the results for those two signal systems that we evaluated. This is the first vendor. And you can see here on the slide, there's different dots. The yellow dots represent daytime counts, and the red squares with a gray center, they represent nighttime. And so you can see that the first vendor, they did pretty good during the day, but not quite as good, actually missed quite a bit at night. However, the second vendor really did just as good at night as they did during the day. And we could say that whenever we presented these results, we could say that with confidence because we had used this process of double-blind counting, and we knew that we were comparing to a ground truth. Okay, here's another example. It's a little bit different. So we were working with People for Bikes at ways to improve their city bike ratings. And so their city bike ratings, they rate all these different cities, and one part of that score is based on how many people ride bikes in that particular city. So we wanted to evaluate a passive data source for its ability to estimate citywide biking. Now, does anyone have any idea how you would ground truth that? No, I don't either. I mean, so if you're familiar with the American Community Survey, ACS, that's not really going to help. ACS is primarily, it's the primary commute mode to work, which doesn't include recreational riding. NHTS, the National Household Travel Survey, that's not much help either. It's got very few samples within each of the cities, and the biking trips tend to be underreported in NHTS. And so that's one of the challenges that we have with big data is sometimes whenever you've got big data, it can be very difficult to compare to a ground truth. And so in some cases, you just have to end up using what you have and essentially use different status quo comparisons and then use your judgment and sort of try and triangulate where you think the error may be. And so what we did in this particular case is we had developed some methods to expand the Strava estimates to total bike riding. So that was one comparison, was these expanded Strava estimates. And the other one was we compared it against about 34, 35 of our trusted bike counter locations that we had here in Texas. And so here's what we found. And so on the left-hand side, this shows the comparisons with the expanded Strava estimates, but it's at the county-wide level. Again, we're trying to replicate what essentially a citywide estimate might look like. And so at the aggregate level, the streetlight biking indexes, they were pretty highly correlated with our expanded Strava estimates. So we've got two different status quo measurements that are lining up pretty well. But then when you get down to the detailed level on the far right, like at these permanent bike counter locations, you tend to see a little bit more variability and you see more scatter in these point estimates. And that's fairly common, especially if big data sources, if they don't have lots of bias, then you're pretty safe with the law of large numbers. And so high-level summary statistics can be pretty safe. Here's the second principle. The second principle comes up a lot in evaluations as well, and it's basically having real-world test conditions. Right, so some vendors, they insist on installing their own devices. They want to come out and they want to spend days configuring and fine-tuning, and then when you come back to them and they sort of have so-so results, well, they want to come back and they want to fine-tune even more and they want to tweak it and, hey, we can get this a little bit better. But that's not real world. That is the absolute best that the technology can provide. And it's definitely not what most users will get if they set up the system in typical field conditions with an installation manual. And so I understand when vendors or manufacturers, when they want to be really involved, but I try to make the testing realistic without days and days of tweaking and calibrating and fine-tuning. And so I most often encounter this with permanent counters where you're installing a device, but I'm going to give a passive crowd sensing example in the next two slides. And so talk about One Bus Away app. So One Bus Away is a real-time transit information app, but it's also a multimodal data collection tool that was created and it's maintained by several universities. And so One Bus Away uses an Android API or application programming interface to essentially guess when your travel activity changes, when your phone starts moving around, and what travel mode you're taking. So it doesn't, because this API exists, this app and lots of other apps, they don't have to ping your phone location a lot. They only ping your phone whenever it thinks that your phone is moving, which is a huge battery saver. I mean, we all have limited cell phone batteries, and we quickly delete the apps that drain our batteries. Here's the great thing, this Android API, I mean, it's essentially the same way that Google tracks you, but Google makes this API available for app developers so that they can collect their own travel activity data, and that's exactly what One Bus Away is doing. So in a joint study with Qatar, with the University of South Florida, we're evaluating how accurate this API is at measuring the mode and location of activity starts and stops, and most importantly, the actual travel mode. And you can see the different modes there at the bottom. I mean, the app will detect, are you walking, are you running, are you still, are you biking, or are you in a vehicle? And that can be very, very useful. In most cases, that's inferred. So in the One Bus Away app evaluation, how are we evaluating the accuracy of this? Well, it's something that we're doing right now this spring. If we wanted to get the best possible results that technology can provide, then we would get some phones and we would put those phones out on we would basically hold the phones out or have them out on the dash of our car or have them out while we're riding or walking around. We would pick the best phone models that have the best GPS chips. We would do it in a dense Wi-Fi network because with dense Wi-Fi you get better location reads. We would do it in wide open spaces away from tall buildings, and we would always keep our phone awake because when your phone's awake, it tends to be talking to apps more often. But we wanted to do real-world testing. And so what we're doing is we've got 6 different models of phones. Some of those are expensive phones. Some of those are what I would call burner phones. They're pretty cheap. They probably don't have as good of a GPS chip. We put those phones in our pockets, or we wrap them up in a bag just like someone would carry it around in a purse or a backpack. We're trying to stay away from Wi-Fi as much as we can, basically staying into where people typically walk or bike or ride. We're trying to include places with tall buildings because tall buildings exist, and we want to know how people move in those environments. And we tend not to use the phones. In other words, we let the phones go into snooze. And so in that way, we hope we're going to have some real-world results. Accuracy in determining mode, just like what we would get from actual users that are using this One Bus Away app. I hope to be able to tell you the results from this study perhaps in the next NatMech. So let's move on to the third point. It looks like my animation is a little messed up, so let me click through. So third principle, it's not just how accurate the technology can measure travel, but is there bias introduced whenever this technology measures travels at scale? In other words, from millions of phones. So there's a really interesting article in Bloomberg News. It's from a professor at Harvard. You can Google this, or you can download from the FilePod. You can click on this hyperlink that's in my presentation. It's a really good article, it's pretty recent, that talks about bias in big data. You know, we think, oh, big data, we're collecting from all these devices, but there's built-in bias to that, and if we're not careful, it can trip us up. So bias is a challenge with big data, and because it's extremely hard to collect ground truth when you're trying to validate data from millions and millions of smartphones. But there are ways to infer whether there's bias, like, for example, looking at characteristics of the sample that you are collecting versus the population, right? And so I used to talk about the smartphone revolution. Oh, man, everybody's got smartphones these days, and we're going to be able to do all this data collection. And I was reading the stats, and I knew that, I guess, a year or so ago, it was about 3 out of 4 people had smartphones. I just asked Google. Google says now, as of February, it's 85% of people have smartphones. And I used to think, oh yeah, with 85% of people, it's a clear, overwhelming majority of people with smartphones that are providing locations on a regular basis. Certainly that's got to be accurate enough to monitor travel. And then a colleague showed me this graphic, which compares the demographics of smartphone LBS apps to census demographics. In other words, all of this LBS data is coming from someone. Who is that coming from, and what are the demographics of who that's coming from? And a couple of things that I'll point real quickly here is some of the bias that's inherent, and that really I didn't even realize it, is that, so here, the study shows that LBS tends to undersample lower income, right? Maybe folks without a car that are biking or walking. So it undersamples lower income, and it oversamples higher income. That's a big deal these days, especially given the discussion on equity. Same thing with age. The study also found that LBS tends to oversample 25 to 34-year-olds while undersampling seniors. You get the animation. That's going to be important for me in 5 or 10 years. I want to be counted. Hopefully, I'm still going to know how to use smartphone apps or whatever is latest and greatest. But so that's important. That's the bias that I talk about, that it's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about big data. Here's another example. So at TTI, we've tested 2 different collision warning systems that are designed for buses. And so in our case, this system was retrofitted onto existing buses. And so our current system has 2 cameras, and I'll try and point to those. There's 2 cameras at the back of the bus, and then there's 1 camera at the front of the bus. So it has 3 cameras that essentially look into the blind spots of those buses. And in the current system, in this collision avoidance system, the bus driver, actually gets a little warning that's right on his console whenever a pedestrian is in close proximity to their bus. right? And so the same way that it gives the driver a warning, it records that event, what we'll call a near-miss event. And so that was our research study, is we want to see how accurate is this collision avoidance system, how accurate is it in detecting pedestrians and cyclists, particularly, say, in a university environment where these buses are really operating in very close proximity to people. Kellyanne, if you could please move that video over. And so I want to show you a video from one of the cameras. And so this is the camera that's installed on the front windscreen. Okay, and so there is a person that I'm going to try and, the person is at the top center. And once I start this, notice that person in the top center. It's actually a lawn maintenance guy. I'm going to go ahead and start the video. It's a lawn maintenance guy running a very loud blower. He doesn't hear the bus coming. And it's a close call. And I have to say, like, watching some of these near-miss videos, it's a bit eerie. I mean, it kind of puts me on the edge of my seat. But this is what, so we have this on buses. This is what a lot of cars, a lot of the newer model cars have on them these days, is they have these collision avoidance systems that see these close calls with pedestrians and cyclists. Okay, you can take that back, Kellyanne. And so those near misses get recorded, and then what happens when those near misses get recorded, they get geotagged with their location, and over the course of several weeks, maybe a month or 2 months, you can develop this hotspot map for quote unquote risky areas along a bus route, or if you're getting it from cars, you can get it everywhere. And so there's kind of this ongoing debate about how well these near misses correspond to collisions in certain contexts. I mean, it seems intuitive, yeah, that was a close call. Eventually there's going to be a crash that happens. But sometimes in some situations, our intuition can fool us. And so we've been looking more at this near miss versus crash thing. And I want to show you, at least from this particular bus system. So here's what we found. I want to say that it's not quite as clear of a correlation as we think, particularly with small samples, but let me explain here with my pointer. And so these red circles that you see here, the big red circles are the near misses from the buses. And the larger they are, the more that the near misses we had. The blue circles, so those blue circles are actual crashes. Same thing, the bigger the blue circle, the more the crashes. And so you can see here at this biggest hotspot, we did have a single bike and pedestrian crash, and it was with a bus, but so did this nearby location. So this nearby location also had a bus pedestrian collision, but it had, let me move the pointer, it had about a third fewer. And over here, we actually have some crash hotspots that didn't even get picked up with near misses, right? And so are near misses from connected vehicles interesting and useful? You bet, they sure are. But we have to proceed carefully until we know more about how they correspond to crashes in different contexts. Okay, so here's my key takeaways. Get rid of my pointer. So you sort of saw this coming. There's not going to be just one perfect data source. There's not going to be one golden data goose that gives us all of this perfect data. Instead, we're going to have to deal with multiple data sources. Some of those data sources are going to be public. Some are going to come from private companies. We're going to have to integrate these sources, line them up, and try and reconcile differences. But my advice is to understand what's being measured and how, rather than just throwing all the data into a single bucket without regard for what it represents or how it was collected. And that's my pitch for Sarisha's presentation. In 2 more slides, she's going to talk about data fusion and integration of multiple data sources. I've got 1 more slide. My third key takeaway, some people get excited about crowd sensing and smartphones, but my advice is this: keep installing and maintaining accurate continuous monitoring stations, because those permanent monitoring stations, they're going to serve as the foundation for testing and calibrating any kind of crowd sensing method. Finally, privacy is a big issue, and we need to understand privacy issues and be proactive about protecting privacy, because if we don't, we risk getting our data spigot turned off. You know, I like to think we're the good people. We're not trying to sell consumers anything. We're trying to use their data for public good, but that may not matter much to some people who may feel like their privacy is being violated. So with that, I think we're gonna take questions after both presentations. But if you want to go ahead and type your questions in the questions panel, I'll start working on my responses. Thank you for listening. Look forward to some more discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Sarisha.
Great. Thanks, Sean, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So today I am going to be talking about how we're using all these data sources that Sean talked about, and how we've been exploring these data fusion techniques to derive bicycle volumes on a network. This project that I'm specifically talking about is a pool fund project that's been funded by NITSE, or National UTC, housed at Portland State University, as well as many DOTs and city agencies around the country. So in addition to myself on the project team from TSU, we also have Joe Broach and Nathan McNeil. From the University of Texas at Arlington, we have Kate Hume, Steve Mattingly, Mintu Mia, Kristen Nordbach from UNC Chapel Hill, and Frank Prue from Urban Footprint. So we all know that bicycling has been growing nationwide, and we have especially seen the increased focus on active transportation modes, especially during the last year with the COVID-19 pandemic. Specific to bicycle commuting, we see that there is a 43% growth nationwide between 2000 and 2017. So how do we measure how much bicycling is taking place? So we do that by counting. And these counts are really important for measuring trends, for planning and designing new infrastructure, for conducting safety analysis, especially when we need to get the exposure metric, and for also measuring economic impacts and health outcomes. And so to obtain these counts, many states have institutionalized counting programs, and these programs generally consist of a mixture of automated counts, or as they're also called, permanent counts and short duration counts. The permanent counts are generally conducted using these automated counters, and they are counts that are taken 24/7, 365 days a year, whereas the short duration counts are more limited in duration, and they can range anywhere from 1 hour to a week to a few months sometimes. So the initial impetus for the counting came with the National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project, which established set dates and times to take manual counts and provided some guidance on how to do so. Then came along the Traffic Monitoring Guide in 2013, and this provided additional guidance on where to count, when to count, and how to count. NCHRP 797, which is the guidebook on pedestrian and bicycle volume data collection, provides a lot of good information on establishing counting programs. And then the 2016 update to the TMG provides a lot of good information on standardizing these counts and the data and the formats as well. So there's been a lot of research that has since been conducted as we've established these counting programs and counts. And we've learned a few things. So we know that when we annualize these short duration counts into annual average estimates, We know that error is lower when day-of-year factors are used. When we take the short duration count for at least 1 week or longer, when we take these counts during the summer where there are higher volumes of cyclists and more activity taking place, we know that the error is lower when there's a commute-only factor group. And when more than one counter per factor group is available to calculate these adjustment factors. So in addition to just directly counting bicyclists, we can also use some models to get volumes. One approach is to use the direct demand models where the bike volume is typically regressed on socio-demographic factors, network measures, land use factors, accessibility, and temporal factors. Another option to get volumes is to use travel demand models. However, these are typically at a zonal level, so they might not produce the site-specific volumes that we may need. And these are also quite complex to estimate, and historically they've not included bicycling in sufficient detail. So as a result, there are only very few agencies around the country like San Francisco or Portland Metro that even have these models with the assignment phase done to allow us to assign those bicycle trips to the network. So despite this proliferation of count sites over the last decade, we've begun to realize that we may never achieve the coverage we need to monitor the entire network with just counters alone. And as Sean said, there is no one single golden data goose. And so the only approach that we have is we have all these disparate data sources. And so the opportunity that we have is to combine these different data sources. So we have the opt-in apps such as Strava. We have the passive or background app like Streetlight. We also have bike share data. So how do we combine all these different data sources with our count data, which includes both the automated counts as well as the manual or the short duration counts, to get to our question of estimating bike volumes on the network. And so this is the overall goal of our project. And so I'm going to share a few more details with you today. So in terms of scope, what we're looking at is to try and understand what are the different data sources that exist and how have they been used to date. And as Sean mentioned, these data sources have been regularly appearing on the scene, and the landscape is constantly changing. And so we need to understand what are the different strengths and weaknesses of each of these data sources. And then in terms of understanding that, we are looking for factors such as accuracy, coverage, completeness, and representativeness for each of these data sources. And then how do we combine these data sources along with our conventional count data to estimate bike volumes on the network? And finally, the most important question, which a lot of us are grappling with, is what relative marginal value do each of these data sources and the model forms add in predicting bicycle volumes relative to what we are going to pay to acquire them, as well as the processing cost. And so in terms of anticipated outcomes, what we hope to achieve at the end of this project is a comprehensive review of these different bicycle volume estimation methods and a catalog of potential third-party data sources. We are going to be evaluating these data sources, how well they work as inputs into the volume estimation process. We'll be developing some model forms to incorporate these data sources and then combine them. And then finally, we will be making all the scripts and the methods that we've developed available on GitHub so that others can use this process as well. Before I go into the data itself, the first task, as I mentioned, was to try and understand what do these different data sources tell us. And so these, the third-party data sources specifically can provide information on trip types and locations that cannot be obtained from the conventional data. But some of the key questions that we need to understand, and that Sean also alluded to earlier, is what is the demographic coverage that each of this data source is providing, and what are the biases that are inherent in each of these data sources. We also need to understand what are the sampling rates of the user data, and how does the sampling rate vary over time. So how much of the sample is each data source capturing? What is the correlation with the observed counts of cyclists, and how is this correlation varying both spatially and temporally? And how much overlap does each of these different data sources have, and then can they complement each other? And finally, do these data sources allow us to do a good job to extrapolate out to the network? So we reviewed quite a few studies, almost 20 in total. And at the time when we performed this review, which was I think over a year ago, most of the studies that we found generally looked at Strava data. And as Sean mentioned, the passive data sources are emerging right now. So we did not find any studies at that time that use these passive data sources. So this review is going to be largely based on the Strava data. So what we learned about demographics from this review is that whatever demographics that we get are generally limited to age, gender, and type of cycling activity, so commuting versus recreational riding. And as Sean mentioned, the equity-related variables, which are really important, such as income and race, are lacking with this data set. And generally, we found that even where user data is available, we do not always get comparison data on the composition of cyclists in a city or region. So we don't know if the data is representative or not. But generally, what we've seen is that Strava users, and this is known, are generally male. They are younger, and they tend to undertake more recreational trips. In terms of the sampling rate, we found that it's generally reported as the third-party count over the full count. And generally, it's calculated from automated counters, but sometimes the full count is also calculated using the annualized short duration count. And Strava sampling rates, what we found are generally less than 10% of all cyclists, but more commonly it's between the 1 to 5% range. However, the sampling rate also varies spatially, even within each region or city. And sometimes we do see a maximum capture rate of 30% depending on specific sites. And especially if these sites are along busy trails or at these urban choke points or bridges. In terms of correlation, what we found is that the overall correlation across all sites as reported from the multiple studies is pretty high, so varies between 0.6 and 0.9. However, there is some wide variation by site, and we've also seen that some sites have shown negative correlation with these third-party data sources. One important point to remember is that sampling rate does not necessarily predict correlation. For example, there was one study in Austin where we found that RIDE report demonstrated comparable correlation results with another data source despite having a much lower sampling rate. So you could just capture maybe 1% of the cyclists that are passing at a location, but you could still have a good correlation with the underlying count. One thing that we did observe is that this specific correlation is not always well described, and the correlation can be sensitive to outliers and these high volume locations. So the correlations have to be interpreted with some caution. So once we completed this review of the literature, we went ahead and selected some sites to conduct and test these data fusion approaches. We selected these sites based on some set criteria. One thing that we wanted to do was to select sites that are distributed geographically, so we did not want to just select sites that were located in one region of the country versus the other. The other criteria we had was we also wanted to study multiple years of data to look at some of these questions that we identified about the stability of the users and the stability of the correlations that we are seeing, because most of the studies that we saw typically just used 1 year of data or were generally done at one location. At the time when we started this project, Strava data was not free yet, and so we had to purchase the Strava data. And so the budget that we had also dictated some of the choice of these locations. So finally, we ended up with 6 sites to study. So we chose Boulder, Charlotte, and Dallas, where we were going to study 1 year of data, so 2019. And in Oregon specifically, in Portland, Lane County, and Deschutes County, we're going to look at 3 years of data, so 2017 to 2019, and these are our enhanced sites. So we'll be testing the stability of some of these temporal relationships. So just a quick run through of each of the data sources. So the Strava, as we know, is an app-based product, and it's an opt-in product. So the user has to enter information about their bike trip once they've completed the trip. And so when we obtained this data, we got the trip data that was matched to the underlying OpenStreetMap network. We were given the hourly, monthly, and the totals. And one thing to note is that the trip purpose is not directly entered, so it's imputed by Strava. And right now, the Strava Metro data is free. So we are in the process of comparing the new Metro free product to the product that we've purchased. And one thing that we did find is that if you're located in a particular state, so for example, since we're in Oregon, we only have access to the free data for the state of Oregon. So we cannot access the data for another state. And also, it does take quite a bit of time to download the data. It's taking us approximately 3 days to download a month of the data. So, and this is with the free product. For the Streetlight data itself, we do get the average daily estimates by month and by weekday and weekend. This process of getting these estimates is a little bit more involved, and we do get a little bit more control on where we get the estimate, because we have to go into this web-based application and manually draw these gates that you can see here on the screen. Let's see. Okay, yeah. These gates are where there are existing count sites. And so we've located the gates right on top of those permanent count sites to get the ADB estimates at that location. And so it is a little bit of a time-consuming process, especially if you do have many count sites in your jurisdiction. Okay, so one of the questions that we often get asked is, so if we know that the Strava data is correlated with the count data, can we just factor up the Strava data to get bike volumes? So what we found is that the portion of the total bicycle traffic that is captured by Strava varies considerably even in the same market. So this plot here is just for the Portland permanent site. And typically we found that the Strava trips represent between 2 to 10% of the average daily bicyclists at the Portland sites. And we just have two outliers here. Let me turn on my pointer. So these two are two outliers, but in general, we see that we're capturing between 2 and 10% of the annual daily bicyclists, which are consistent with other studies. Temporal stability was even better, and but even at the same location, we do have these expansion factors that are changing considerably. So in 2017, for example, we see that the expansion factor that we calculate at this one location is 6.5%. But in 2019, it changes to 9%. And so because of this variation and this general upward trend, we cannot use a single factor to just factor up the data. And we think this upward trend is because of the expanded user base between the different years. So we also added Boulder data, and here you see that Boulder had even more extreme outliers. So we have this one location, where at this site, Strava is reporting almost 50% of the total bicycle traffic. And this is primarily a recreational route that's just outside of town. In Boulder, we saw that the capture rate was generally lower than what we were seeing in Portland. And this is possibly due to the higher shares of college student traffic within the city limits. And so this could also highlight another issue, that we should probably not transfer these Strava factors across locations. And if we do that, that could introduce additional error. And then, so here's a plot that shows what happens if we just estimate a simple expansion function without adding these additional contextual or land use variables. So all the points above the 45-degree line are over predictions, and the points below are under predictions. And here we've just done a simple prediction with a linear regression model of permanent counter average daily bicyclists on the Strava average daily bicyclist. And so while there is clearly some information that we can get from the Strava data, the errors that we get by just factoring the Strava data would be unacceptably high at most locations. And this is just when you're applying at the same location. And so applying these to additional locations would likely result in even greater error. So that's why we cannot just factor the Strava data. So what about streetlight data? So as I mentioned, streetlight data is different in that it does give you a direct estimate of the average daily bicyclist traffic. Here again, we're seeing the same plot of the streetlight estimate versus the simple average daily bicyclist estimate from the permanent count. And similar to what we are seeing with the Strava data is that the error is quite large. The mean average percent errors were greater than 100% if we just use the simple factor. And another thing to note is that Streetlight's methodology and sample changed significantly from 2018 to 2019. And so looking at Boulder, again, we see very similar patterns to Portland, though we do not see these extreme outliers, but again, the same trend that we cannot just factor up the data sources. So in terms of the fusion methods, we tried a number of fusion methods and we looked at very city-specific models to start off the entire process. We started with Portland and then moved on to Boulder, and it was a very time-consuming and very time-intensive process to gather all these contextual variables for each city, and each city has different ways in which it stores these variables. Some variables are available in one city and they're not available. The underlying networks are different. And so it was getting to be a very complex process. And so at the end of that whole exercise, we decided that we want to try and create a method that is applicable to a number of cities with consistent data that we gather from each city, so that then we can develop these pooled models. And we can pool all the data from the different cities and develop one model. And so we've since then refined our approach to use the OpenStreetMap network to gather all the network variables. That way we have a consistent source for information across every city. And then we are using the NHGIS, which is based on the census data to gather all the census and the demographic variables. And we are then going to be applying these fusion methods. So our baseline model will just use the static data, that is all these land use and contextual variables, along with the permanent counts to estimate bike volumes. And then to that baseline model, we will be adding each of these data sources one at a time, and then understand what happens to the error. And so that way we can really understand what is the impact of each of these data sources on the estimation error itself. And there are a few different modeling forms that we are going to be trying. So we start off with the negative binomial, which is the linear modeling approach, and then looking at the decision trees or the advanced models. And finally, looking at some of the machine learning techniques and the random forest models. Then we're also going to look at transferability. So can the model that's developed with data from one location or the pool location, can it be applied to a different location? And can the model that's developed with data from 1 year be applied to estimate volumes in a different year? Because we also need to understand what are the limitations of these models. And so what are our preliminary findings? So what we found from our preliminary modeling efforts are that these emerging data sources such as Strava or Streetlight do present a great opportunity for us to use the data from throughout the network. And we found that when using Strava and Streetlight together, we did reduce estimation errors, especially in the utilitarian clusters, by 15% for the mid-volume locations and 100% for the low-volume locations. And what we found over and over again was that these data sources are really helping us to reduce that estimation error for the low-volume locations, because we do not have very much information at those low-volume sites. And for the recreational cluster, we reduced the errors by about 14%. And then we saw that Strava and Streetlight for Boulder also reduced the error by 30% for the plain sites. We found that at the high volume sites, these static variables, so the land use and weather and other network variables are able to really explain or capture volumes at these sites. And so, as I just mentioned, the real benefit of Strava and Streetlight is when we're trying to expand out to the network at these low volume locations where we do not have these counters. And our early findings show that bike share data really did not improve estimation outcomes. But as I mentioned, we have done a revamp of our modeling framework and process, and so we'll see if these results continue to hold. So based on that, what we are finding is that these network-wide estimation models require reasonable ground truth data, which can be either from the annual permanent counters or these short-term counts. And as Sean also mentioned, so we do need these ground truth data at a number of sites to basically build our models. And so one of the things that we were finding is that these count programs, when they're first established, the counters were generally placed at locations where there were higher bike volumes. And this is basically, this was done to either explain or show the importance of counting these bicyclists to policymakers and such. But we also need to be counting at these low volume sites also, because we do need that information to build and train our models. While Strava data mitigates some of these concerns at the low volume sites, we do want to also try and focus some of our counters at these low volume sites. And just based on our early results and the earlier modeling structure, we found that the decision tree based modeling outperformed the other modeling forms. And we also found that we need a lot more data to ensure transferability. In some of the sites, we do on paper have like 15 counters or 20 counters, but then when you start digging into the data and see how long each counter has been up, ultimately you just end up with maybe 4 or 5 usable counters. And so we do need a lot more points to try and understand the patterns and try to ensure this transferability. And we also have to be very cautious when we are trying to transfer these models, that we avoid extrapolating the patterns beyond what we observe in the training data sets itself. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to present. And currently we are wrapping up the final models, and the final report should be out in the next few months. And with that, I'm happy to turn it to Sierra to start off the Q&A.
Thank you, Sureisha and Sean. These were extremely interesting presentations, and I was taking lots of notes as we went along. So I'm going to re-invite participants on the line. If you do have a question, please type that into the question pod, and we'll be going back and forth between the presenters to ask questions. So the first question up is for Sean, and it's from Elizabeth Stoltz, and she says, do you know why some sites resulted in more actual crashes when comparing the actual crashes to near misses? And I think that's when you showed the slide of the map that had the bus bike ped crashes on them with the blue dots versus the red dots were the near misses.
Yeah. So I would say that was a preliminary look. We were testing that collision avoidance system on one bus, so it wasn't everywhere. But there's two reasons why it's different. However, I'm going to say up front, whenever you're looking at data summaries and visualizations, ask questions about heat maps and other things. Just understand how this data is being collected. So the one near-miss hotspot, that near-miss quote-unquote hotspot was right at one of the busiest pedestrian crossings on campus, and it was right at a stop sign, and the near-miss system was active until about 1 or 2 miles per hour, and so buses would basically pull up to that stop sign. They would be going fast enough and were within range that it would trigger near misses if there was someone crossing at the crosswalk. So it was a little bit deceiving. The other place that you saw where there were a lot of crashes but not near misses, in that particular case, the bus route didn't turn from the street. In other words, the crashes were coming from turning vehicles, but the bus was not turning. The bus was traveling straight along the arterial. So the bus isn't going to have any near misses because it's busy sidewalks, and in some cases bicyclists riding on sidewalks. So again, I think you need to be careful when you look at hotspot maps and understand, ask questions of the vendors about how different things work.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sean. I think definitely digging more into the data is always useful in order to understand what it is that you're seeing on a map. I'm going to actually stay with you, Sean, and ask this next question that Liz has here. Did you use any continuous count monitoring data when looking at actual crashes versus near misses? Did you have accurate exposure data at the sites? What were the changes in exposure over time? Did you have high volume? Yeah. And I think you touched on that a little bit as far as the context of those locations and the crossing behaviors. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So the map that I showed there, that was a quick afterthought after we had evaluated that system. So we didn't do a thorough analysis, but I will tell you that we are in other ongoing studies. We're looking at hard braking and other near-miss indicators for driving, not for biking and walking, but for driving. And we're essentially trying to do that, try to do a more thorough analysis and understand better about how some of these near misses, in what specific context do near misses lead to collisions, and in what other context do they not lead to near misses. I mean, I think we've all, or a lot of you have probably seen the videos of some of like streets in Vietnam, in like Hanoi City or Ho Chi Minh, where these people are basically, pedestrians are wading out into traffic. I mean, that's a lot of near misses, but from what I understand, I've never been there, they do fine in near misses. And so I think in some cases, near misses lead to collisions in certain contexts, and in other cases, it's kind of a red herring. And I think we just need to understand better before we dive into the deep end of the near miss pool.
Really, really good point there, and that tends to make it even more complex when you're trying to understand bicycle and pedestrian safety and you feel like you don't have enough crash data, so you're now looking for near-miss data, but then that's questionable as well. Okay, on to the next question. Sarisha, this one's for you. It's also from Liz. She says, did you look at weather variables at the site? For example, rainy day volumes versus sunny days?
Yes. Hi, Liz. Yes, we did look at weather and variables. We did a scan through the literature and found that generally average humidity, precipitation, and average temperature were the variables that were most often used in the literature, and that's what we used.
Great. A question going back to Sean. I'm going down to Raghu Kaushik, and I apologize if I butchered your name. Sean, he says, do you have insight into the demographics or biases of people with privacy concerns?
I don't, but I think that would be an interesting subject. I may ask Google about that later today, just because I think there are some people that are more apt to be very concerned about privacy and turn off location services. And so, like, for example, I am, because I'm a data geek and I know what data is being collected, but in fact, I'm on the other end of the spectrum where I am giving my data to Google because I'm trying to see how much it's actually collecting on me. And you can do this. Go to, if you have Android, go to your Google timeline history, or if you have iOS, just turn on your Google location services and you can see what, it's pretty amazing. And it's pretty scary at times, but I think the biggest thing is awareness. But no, to that specific question, I can't answer that.
Okay, and then Sarisha, I believe this question may be to you from Charlene Mingus. What role do you think short-term counters play?
Yeah, a pretty important role actually, based on what we're finding. So the permanent counters give us those temporal patterns, right? So they tell us how much variation we can see day to day, year over year, but at the same location. But then when we want to expand to the network and try to estimate volumes, we need that spatial coverage, and that's where having those short-term counters really helps because they give us the ability to expand beyond the 4 or 5 permanent count sites, or even 10 to sometimes hundreds if city chooses to collect quite a few. And so yeah, I think the short-term counts are really important.
Can I say something about that too,
Yes,
Sarah?
please. Yeah.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to look 5 years into the future. Sarisha is right in that right now it's what we got in many cases. We got to put out these short duration counters. I'm involved in evaluating passive data sources on the motor vehicle side, and I think in the next year or two, short-term counters for motor vehicles are going to start receding. They're going to start dying. It could be a quick death. It could be a slow, but I think short-term counters for cars are going away. I think it's a matter of how many years it's going to take aggregators and data analytics companies to give us something that's usable for bicyclists and pedestrians. And I think there's still going to be some scenarios where you're going to want to have that short duration count equipment, special studies, things like that, where you may need to go out and you want to know for sure what's going on, or you want to have some special analytics done with video, or you want to see more behavior or something like that.
Sean, just to follow up, are you saying this because you think that probe data or other data sources will wind up providing that coverage data that we would otherwise be looking to get with short duration counts?
I think so. I'm gonna put on my, I'm gonna look into my crystal ball and say it's gonna happen. I don't know if it's gonna be before I retire. Hopefully it's before I retire, because that would be neat to see. But it's happening right now for motor vehicles. Obviously there's a lot more motor vehicles. It's easier with cars. But I think there's potential for that to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Interesting. So this may be a little bit of a follow-up question from Samuel Shelton, who asks, any tips for multimodal video count technology? Any specific developing software or hardware to watch?
So Samuel, ask Google for my email address, or it's on my slides. I can give you, I don't want to provide any specific endorsements here. There are a couple that are better than others. But the best thing to do is ask around, get on a listserv, APBP, others, and ask folks what they've seen, what they've heard about different companies.
And I'll just put a shameless plug in here for if you haven't registered for the NatMech virtual conference event that's happening at the end of June 21st through 25th. I would encourage you to attend that because a lot of the vendors participate in this kind of a conference as well, and there's a few different opportunities that we have set up for participants to interact with and ask questions of various vendors, virtual booths essentially with them. So that may be another place where you could learn more about the video technology that's available and accuracy of it. Okay, we have another question that came in from Liz. Other than having an active traffic volume monitoring program, what other advice would you give to data programs and data users, such as safety engineers, for using data? For example, it's important to have a good site selection process to select monitoring locations and developing standard methodologies.
So I think Liz,
yeah,
I'll take a shot at it and let Sirisha answer too. But I think Liz gets the gold star for participation. See if we can't get that on an ITE certificate. So here's something that I think is important. Sometimes we're data people and we get excited about data. Talk to the users and find out, some of these people just don't get excited, and some things that we think matter doesn't matter to them, and some things that we don't think about may matter to them. And so, we may try and get precision to the third decimal point, and really they're just looking for, hey, I just need a ballpark number. Is it high, medium, low? But I guess understanding how people are using it, not having sort of these walls between the collectors and the users. I think, Liz, when you were at CDOT, you had a great thing. It was a data committee that was statewide that had all different types of people, and just communicating and people asking questions of each other and learning from each other what was important, what was their hot spots, what was their issues.
Sirisha, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sean, and I mean, that was the first thought that sparked into my head as well, is trying to understand the purpose of the data collection. So why are we collecting the data, and what is it going to be used for? And so I think that would totally guide the where we want to select sites, locate sites, and such. And I think Liz, with the NC site selection process, I think you'd established a very good guideline for where to select sites and or where to locate sites, and I think we definitely need more of that.
Yeah, so this kind of gets back to Sirisha. I think in your presentation you mentioned that for some of the early programs that were developed, they maybe installed counters in locations where they expected to have higher volumes of bicyclists because they wanted something to count, basically. But that doesn't necessarily give you a true representation of the network if you're using just high count locations to understand or to estimate or draw conclusions from when you're extrapolating across the network. And so that kind of also ties back to one of Sean's principles when he was talking about the status quo versus ground truthing and kind of like how do you know what's true data or accurate data, or if you're using the permanent count locations as your standard, but it's also not accurate for whatever reason it may be, then what do we do?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question for sure, and yeah, I don't know if Sean has some thoughts on that, but I think definitely we do need counting at varied locations, and as Sean mentioned, if these data sources do pan out and we do notice that they are giving us good estimates, then maybe we can just use these data sources and not bother with the short duration counts at all those low volume sites, and then just use the data from these sources to estimate our volumes.
Any other thoughts from you, Sean?
No, I think I'm with y'all on that. I see we've got another question. I want to make sure we answer that before we wrap up.
Yep. So the last question, we may have time for one more if somebody else types something in, but the last question as of now from Raghu. When do you expect the FHWA's HPMS to catch up with using emerging data sources? So he's talking specifically about vehicle data.
So I guess I opened up a Pandora's box. Are you allowed to talk about motor vehicles on a Bike Ped webinar? Is that permissible?
I'd say it's fair game if you have expertise and can answer the question.
Since we have a couple minutes, no. It could be soon because right now Federal Highway is sponsoring a pooled fund study that we are one of the independent evaluators, TTI that is, and we're evaluating a passive data provider for their ability to estimate annual motor vehicle counts. And so if we deem them to be accurate enough, and if Federal Highway believes our evaluation, then it's quite possible that you'll be seeing some changes for motor vehicles in the next year or so.
Very interesting. Well, with that, I am going to turn it back over to Kelly Ann, as I don't see any other questions in the question pod to take us out.
Thank you, Sarah. On behalf of ITE today, I would like to thank our presenters, Sean and Sirisha, for taking the time today to present. And Sarah,